Welcome to the research desk. Imagine sitting at your desk on a Tuesday morning, executing a specialized workflow you've, managed successfully for the last 5 years.
Right, just a standard day.
Exactly. But suddenly, an unexpected calendar invite appears. You're pulled into this brief, completely clinical virtual meeting and informed that your role has been eliminated.
Just like that.
Just like that. And then, a few hours later, your chief executive issues a press release to the market, attributing this massive workforce reduction to the unprecedented efficiencies of artificial intelligence.
Which is incredibly jarring for the employee, obviously.
It is, because you're left sitting at home looking at a screen, knowing for an absolute fact that the internal software your company was testing barely functioned. It hallucinated basic facts and required constant human supervision.
Yeah, it's a completely disjointed reality.
And you are not alone in this experience. Right now, 47% of Americans are reporting a genuine visceral fear that automation will take their livelihoods.
Which, looking at the macro environment, is entirely justified.
It really is. Amazon is currently cutting 14,000 roles, while heavily touting artificial intelligence efficiency to their shareholders. Oracle is slashing thousands of positions. Wall Street analysts are projecting a staggering 200,000 job losses across the financial sector in the coming years.
Those are just massive figures.
They are. And this brings us to a fundamental defining tension of the modern corporate era. When a massive corporation announces an AI-driven layoff, is that a verified technological fact? Or is it merely a highly effective public relations strategy?
Right. That is the core question.
I hold the structural rewiring thesis. I'm arguing that artificial intelligence is genuinely collapsing staffing ratios in text-heavy knowledge work right now.
And I take the bear case. I'll be demonstrating that if we rigorously stress test these corporate claims, we uncover a clear pattern of old-fashioned cost-cutting dressed up in futuristic language. It's driven entirely by margin protection and shareholder rewards, rather than actual technological displacement.
Okay, so let's move away from the broad, abstract anxiety of those macro numbers for a minute. We need to examine the immediate operational reality on the corporate floor.
Yeah, let's look at the mechanics.
Right, we have to look at how a job actually disappears in the real world. Because the core argument for structural rewiring is not that an AI model just drops out of the sky and replaces an entire company overnight.
No, of course not. That's a science fiction narrative.
Exactly. It completely obscures the actual mechanical shift taking place in the economy. The reality is much more granular. The technology is replacing enough individual tasks within specific functions to force a total ground-up redesign of corporate workflows.
Okay, but how does that actually play out in a department?
Well, so how does a role actually disappear? Think about this for a second. Pause. It does not disappear because a machine does 100% of a human's job flawlessly. It disappears because a machine does enough of the baseline workflow that one single person can now supervise and finalize what used to require 3, 5, or 10 people.
So it's about the ratio?
Yes, exactly. We are witnessing a radical shift in the supervisor to producer ratio. And to understand where this hits hardest, we have to clearly define the vulnerability zone.
What does that zone look like?
Highly exposed work shares 4 distinct traits. First, it is standardized, meaning it follows predictable rules and formats. Second, it's text-centric, operating entirely within language, code, or numbers.
Right, so not physical labor.
Correct. Third, it is easy to quality check, meaning a human supervisor can look at the final output and immediately verify if it's correct or incorrect. And fourth, it's organized in modular units.
Meaning isolated tasks?
Exactly. The work can be broken down into discrete, isolated tasks that don't require deep cross-departmental context. When a workflow fits those 4 criteria, the AI model doesn't actually need to possess human-level brilliance. It only needs to be cheaper, fast enough, and just good enough to produce a rough draft.
Okay, I followed the theory. Do we have a concrete example?
We do. We can look at Duolingo to see this entire landscape in miniature. In January of 2024, Duolingo cut 10% of their contractors involved in translation and content work.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah. And they explicitly linked that reduction to their increasing reliance on generative artificial intelligence to handle those specific modular translation tasks.
Which fits your 4 traits perfectly.
Exactly. And by April of that same year, they had rebranded their entire public image as an artificial intelligence first company. This is the exact mechanism of structural displacement. The workflow collapse was absolutely real in a highly narrow, vulnerable task domain.
And then they spun it.
Right. Management immediately broadened that narrow success into a strategic branding exercise to drive their market valuation.
Well, look, the Duolingo case is a factual event. I won't deny that. But analyzing it requires us to understand the underlying mechanics of corporate labor structures, specifically the concept of the labor buffer.
The labor buffer.
Yeah, in any major organization, contractors act as a financial shock absorber. They're the first labor buffer to be cut when experimental tools become, merely good enough to handle basic overflow work.
Or when budgets get tight.
Exactly. Sometimes a company simply needs to tighten its belt for a quarter. A contractor reduction is a vastly different economic and operational event than a full-time employee displacement.
True, there's less friction.
There's virtually no friction in letting them go. That's precisely why they exist. So translating that highly specific, low-friction contractor reduction into a sweeping, structural thesis about full-time employee displacement across the global economy, that requires a massive leap of faith.
I see your point. But
You're pointing to a highly modular task, basic language translation, performed by the absolute most vulnerable peripheral tier of the workforce, and you're using that to validate a narrative that threatens the core, integrated white-collar labor market.
that's where it starts.
Maybe, but we must aggressively question whether that microcosm genuinely scales to structural displacement. Cutting peripheral contractors is a localized efficiency gain. Claiming that this signals the obsolescence of the modern knowledge worker is a marketing narrative. Companies are eager to push it, but it just isn't supported by the operational reality of full-time employment.
I disagree that this is contained strictly to the periphery, because we can physically observe this logic scaling up the corporate ladder.
How so?
The workflow collapse infects enterprise-wide budgeting and management layers long before the technology itself reaches universal, flawless maturity. We don't need to wait for perfect company-wide deployment to see the profound economic impact.
Because they're planning for it in advance?
Exactly. Corporate behavior and forward planning reveal exactly where the capital is flowing. Consider IBM. They instituted a massive, highly publicized hiring pause specifically for non-customer-facing roles that they believed artificial intelligence could eventually perform.
Right, that made huge headlines.
It did. The chief executive went on the record declaring that roughly 30% of those back-office roles could be replaced by artificial intelligence and automation over a 5-year period.
But that's a forward-looking statement.
Yes, and that forward-looking statement is the critical mechanism here. It proves that executive management is actively planning their future headcount around expected automation capacity. Once that expectation enters the corporate budgeting cycle, the labor structure begins changing immediately.
So the tech doesn't even have to work perfectly yet.
Right. The AI model does not actually need to be perfect today if the human hiring budget for tomorrow has already been permanently eliminated. Pause. And we see the exact same forward planning mechanism executing across Wall Street. The projection of 200,000 jobs expected to be shed in the banking sector is not a random macroeconomic guess.
No, it's targeted.
Highly targeted. It's an assessment of vulnerability. Banking is exceptionally exposed because the entire industry is built on a foundation of reporting, rigorous compliance checks, massive document handling, and preliminary due diligence.
Which fits your vulnerability zone.
Exactly. Think about a standard Know Your Customer workflow or the preliminary gathering of financial histories for a loan origination. These are classic white-collar routines with strictly measurable outputs and repetitive, highly regulated formats. They sit squarely in the vulnerability zone.
So, what happens to the managers?
Well, when the base layer of data processing is automated, the logic moves straight up the corporate ladder and begins to aggressively squeeze middle management.
For decades, the modern corporation placed a massive premium on managers whose primary function was information routing.
Sure, aggregating data.
Right. But if a generative system can instantly summarize meeting transcripts, synthesize weekly performance data across multiple departments, and draft a coherent executive report, the layers of managers whose sole value was aggregating those updates are suddenly exposed.
The reporting chain gets flattened?
Exactly. The final reporting role does not vanish, but the number of humans required in the middle of that reporting chain collapses entirely. Okay. But if we're going to talk about enterprise-wide planning, we have to talk about the monumental gap between a successful, narrow pilot in a highly controlled sandbox environment and actual, live enterprise deployment.
It is a significant hurdle, yes.
It's more than a hurdle. The assumption underlying your thesis is that expected automation capacity translates seamlessly into operational reality. It rarely does. Enterprise-grade AI requires a specific architecture that the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies simply do not possess today.
What's missing?
Well, first, it requires immaculately clean, structured, and unified data. Most legacy companies have their data fragmented across dozens of siloed, decades-old systems that literally cannot communicate with one another.
Data silos are a real issue.
A massive issue. Second, it requires scarce, incredibly expensive technical talent to constantly tune and maintain the models so they don't hallucinate critical business information.
Right. You need engineers.
And third, it requires complex application programming interface integration into those legacy systems without breaking existing security protocols. And finally, it requires massive ongoing computational power that fundamentally changes the operating expenses of the IT department.
Okay, but companies are still achieving localized efficiency.
Sure, a localized chatbot in Tier 1 customer service or a specialized coding assistant for a small team of software developers might yield measurable individual efficiency gains. But a coding assistant does not genuinely eliminate an entire engineering department.
So you think it's mostly narrative?
Completely. The leap from a chief executive stating to the press, "We are aggressively experimenting with AI," to a press release claiming AI just caused our mass layoffs is a rhetorical leap. It is an exercise in narrative building. The technology driving these headlines is still overwhelmingly at the proof of concept stage in these major enterprises.
And you're saying a proof of concept doesn't justify a layoff.
Exactly. Proofs of concept are not production-ready systems. Workflow assistance is not full-scale labor replacement. When companies announce these massive, sweeping cuts across incredibly diverse business units, from marketing to human resources to logistics, they are implicitly claiming a level of unified technological maturity that simply does not exist yet behind their closed doors.
Okay, but if the technology's genuinely still trapped in the sandbox and these systems aren't fully ready for flawless enterprise-wide deployment, then how do you explain the timing? Why are these mass layoffs happening right now at this exact moment, explicitly under the banner of artificial intelligence efficiency?
Well, you just have to look at the actual financial numbers backing these decisions. Pause. Wait. Look at the numbers. Alphabet cut roughly 12,000 jobs while quietly conducting $115 billion in stock buybacks across a 2-year period.
$115 billion.
Yes. Meta eliminated 21,000 jobs, alongside an authorization for $60 billion in buybacks. Microsoft cut 11,000 jobs while returning roughly $65 billion in buybacks and another $35 billion in dividends to their shareholders.
Wow. So they had the capital.
Exactly. When you look at the sheer scale of that capital return, it spells out an undeniable, concrete conclusion. These massive technology companies were not technologically forced into labor reductions by a sudden, irresistible artificial intelligence breakthrough that rendered their workforce obsolete overnight.
They were choosing to do it.
They were executing classic margin optimization, they were signaling financial discipline to Wall Street after years of hypergrowth, and they were using their excess cash to artificially inflate their earnings per share by retiring their own stock.
And AI is just the cover story?
This is the absolute core of the bear case. Artificial intelligence is simply being deployed as a valuation-friendly alibi for structural financial choices that executive management already wanted or frankly needed to make.
Because the macroeconomic environment changed.
Right. We are transitioning out of a period of zero interest rate policy into higher capital costs. We have fading pandemic-era digital demand. Investors are applying intense, relentless pressure for immediate profitability, rather than unconstrained growth.
So the narrative changes everything.
Exactly. In that environment, if a chief executive tells the market we are cutting 20,000 jobs because we fundamentally misjudged consumer demand and overexpanded our workforce, that sounds like a catastrophic failure of leadership. The stock will be punished.
But if they frame it differently,
Right. If that exact same executive tells the market we are undergoing a strategic workforce reduction to transform our capital structure for the AI era, that sounds like visionary, aggressive leadership. The stock price surges.
the timing mismatch you mentioned perfectly exposes this underlying reality.
Yes, these broad, sweeping headcount cuts are happening years before enterprise AI deployment can actually replace the specific daily workflows of the workers being eliminated. The layoffs are an exercise in capital allocation, completely disconnected from technological substitution.
That is a highly compelling framework. And honestly, academic valuation theory actually validates the exact mechanism you were describing.
How so?
Well, in modern financial markets, investors don't merely pay for realized historical fundamentals. They pay for expected future cash flows and, crucially, the specific growth narratives that support those expectations.
Right, the story matters as much as the current revenue.
Exactly. Wall Street fundamentally values technology companies differently than traditional industrial firms. They apply a premium multiple to earnings based on the assumption of infinite frictionless software scale.
So human capital is just a drag on that multiple.
Yes. Within that theoretical framework, human capital is essentially being treated as a fungible financial asset, one that can be narrated in whatever language best supports multiple expansion.
It's all about the multiple.
If equity investors broadly believe that artificial intelligence will eventually enable durable, long-term margin expansion by breaking the linear relationship between revenue growth and headcount growth, management has a massive financial incentive to act as if that future has already arrived.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. The company reorganizes its entire capital structure, eliminates the workforce, and points to the technology as the catalyst, thereby securing the valuation premium today for a technological reality that might not mature for another half-decade.
Precisely. And Oracle provides the perfect, transparent illustration of this capital allocation reality.
They recently slashed thousands of jobs across multiple divisions, didn't they?
They did. But to understand why, we must frame this not as a sophisticated software algorithm sitting at a desk executing the work of a human being. We must frame it as a brutal, traditional budgetary choice.
Where does the budget need to go?
Infrastructure. Labor is simply the easiest, fastest place for management to extract savings in order to fund the truly staggering capital expenditure demands of artificial intelligence infrastructure.
The data centers.
Exactly. Participating in the artificial intelligence race requires building entirely new, specialized data centers. It requires purchasing tens of thousands of advanced graphical processing units from companies like NVIDIA, which cost tens of thousands of dollars apiece.
It's massively capital intensive.
It is. A company facing those immense, immediate cash demands must free up internal resources and protect their operating margins to avoid taking on ruinous debt. Cutting the administrative staff pays for the server racks.
Wow. So it's a direct transfer of capital from payroll to hardware.
Yes. But that financial reality does not mean the servers are actually performing the daily jobs of the staff that were just eliminated. They are two distinct, fundamentally different economic events.
But they merge them in the press release?
Conflating the two into a single narrative allows executives to completely avoid taking public responsibility for painful, highly disruptive resource reallocation.
This is where we cross from the raw financial data directly into the philosophical and evidentiary core of the debate. If the capital incentives to lie, or at least to aggressively exaggerate, are this massive, how do we actually prove what is happening inside the black box of these specific firms?
Well, I think the most rigorous framework we can apply to this problem actually comes from the legal system. Think about the basic mechanics of a criminal trial.
Okay, a trial.
In a court of law, establishing motive is fundamentally different from proving mechanism. A prosecutor can present overwhelming evidence that a suspect had a profound financial motive to commit a crime, but establishing that motive does not prove the suspect actually possessed the weapon, let alone used it successfully.
So the motive is the valuation bump.
Exactly. We are currently looking at a corporate environment where the motive is blindingly obvious to anyone paying attention. Executive management desperately wants the investor class to believe that AI caused their layoffs, because that specific framing drives multiple expansion and secures executive compensation tied to stock performance.
So I've established the motive perfectly.
You have, but that motive does not prove the mechanism. It does not prove that a production-grade, highly reliable AI system actually mapped, integrated, and permanently replaced a defined human workflow on the corporate floor.
And you're saying they aren't providing the proof of mechanism?
Not at all. Right now, we are witnessing a massive, systemic crisis of evidentiary discipline across the entire corporate landscape. There is almost zero empirical proof being provided by these companies to back up their sweeping public claims of technological displacement.
You just put out the headline.
Just the headline. Executive boards rarely, if ever, show function-level output per employee before and after an AI deployment. They absolutely refuse to disclose exactly which specific departmental workflows were successfully automated.
That's a great point. We rarely see the before and after metrics.
Never. Furthermore, they don't document or release the data on whether customer outcomes, external satisfaction scores, or internal operational error rates held steady after the human layer was removed.
So without that
granular functional evidence, the phrase AI-driven layoff is nothing more than a narrative convenience. It functions as an empty linguistic vessel, carefully designed by public relations teams to hold whatever generic restructuring plans executives already wanted to execute.
if we look backward, corporate history provides a perfect mirror for this exact behavior.
It really does.
We've seen this specific linguistic strategy deployed to pacify the market in every major economic cycle of the last 30 years. During the dot-com bust in the early 2000s, as companies realized they had drastically overbuilt their workforce for an internet economy that was scaling slower than expected, what did they give us?
Digital transformation.
Exactly. The phrase digital transformation was used to justify mass firings. Then, following the 2008 financial crisis, when pure survival required slashing payrolls, human resources departments gave us the sterile language of efficiency cycles and right-sizing.
And streamlining.
Yes, in the aftermath of the early 2000s overexpansion, we were given streamlining. Today's artificial intelligence language functions identically to those historical buzzwords. It is a rhetorical anesthetic.
It numbs the market to the reality of the cuts.
However, it's significantly more seductive to investors because it points forward to an imagined, highly profitable technological utopia, rather than pointing backward to a fundamental management failure.
It's brilliant PR.
It is. But this dynamic creates a severe structural asymmetry of accountability. The narrative value of artificial intelligence is immediate and tangible for a chief executive. The stock price bumps the exact moment the press release hits the wire.
But the operational value lags behind.
Massively. The actual necessity of the software working flawlessly, day in and day out, to replace a human workflow without breaking the business, that reality is years away. The current moment deeply resembles the internet boom in reverse.
How so?
Well, instead of raising capital to build highly speculative, unprofitable companies, modern executives are executing highly speculative, disruptive labor decisions. The firings are running entirely ahead of the productive reality of the tools.
That exact asymmetry of accountability is precisely why we have to examine institutions that actively reject the consensus Wall Street narrative.
We need a counterexample.
Exactly. If much of the AI layoff narrative is, as we suspect, an institutional choice to protect margins and satisfy investors under the guise of innovation, we learn the most by examining a company that was handed the exact same technology but made a radically different structural choice.
And BNP Paribas serves as the ultimate wild card in this scenario. Their approach challenges the core assumptions of both the bull and bear cases.
What are they doing differently?
While the rest of the global market is aggressively debating which departments to eliminate and who gets replaced first, BNP Paribas is rolling out artificial intelligence companions to all of their staff
across the enterprise.
To everyone.
To everyone. They are explicitly deploying the tools to augment baseline human capabilities, not to subtract human headcount. Let's consider the mechanics of that choice. This single corporate decision shatters the argument of pure technological determinism.
Because the tool doesn't force the layoff.
Exactly. It categorically proves that the exact same foundational model, the exact same software architecture, can operate as a firing machine at one company and as an augmentation layer at another. The underlying technology itself does not dictate the layoff. The management philosophy and the specific financial pressures applied to that management dictate the layoff.
This completely breaks open the organizational politics of the transition. We really have to break down the implicit social contract inherent in how a company introduces a disruptive tool.
It's a massive cultural shift.
It is. By focusing entirely on productivity enhancement across the existing workforce rather than the selective, punitive elimination of vulnerable departments, BNP Paribas is making a deliberate, highly calculated institutional choice.
And what does that choice achieve?
That choice preserves employee morale, which is an intangible but critical driver of productivity. It maintains deep institutional trust, and most importantly, it ensures long-term execution because the staff won't be paralyzed by the constant looming fear that they are actively training their own digital replacements every time they correct the model's output.
That fear is paralyzing.
It absolutely is. The real defining divide in the global economy right now is not between firms equipped with artificial intelligence and firms operating without it.
It's how they use it.
The true divide is between firms utilizing AI to fundamentally redesign their workflows for higher total output versus firms utilizing AI as a convenient market-approved excuse to justify brutal headcount cuts.
In the augmentation model.
The technology becomes a lever for broad-based capability expansion.
And in the replacement model?
In the replacement model, it becomes a weaponized language for selective elimination. The long-term outcomes of those two radically different operating philosophies will entirely shape the competitive corporate landscape for the next decade.
This brings our analysis of macro-financial realities and micro-workflow changes together into a cohesive, layered synthesis of what is actually happening on the ground. We have to reject the simplistic binary question of whether this phenomenon is entirely real or entirely fake.
It's rarely that simple.
Right. The reality is far more complex. AI washing to please Wall Street and genuine structural labor substitution are not mutually exclusive events. They are happening simultaneously, often inside the exact same enterprise.
A layered reality.
Exactly. At the macro public announcement level, when you see those headline numbers of 10,000 or 20,000 layoffs, the vast majority of that is traditional cost-cutting, pandemic-era overexpansion correction, and pure AI washing to drive the stock multiple.
But at the task level,
If you look closely at the granular task level, specifically for junior white-collar workers, for external contractors, and for middle management coordinators whose primary job is routing information, the displacement is incredibly real and permanent.
so the workflow is changing.
The technology is genuinely draining the component tasks out of those specific jobs week by week until those roles can no longer justify their old headcount. The public narrative is wildly overstated at the enterprise level, but the workflow substitution is an undeniable structural fact at the task level.
But that layered simultaneous reality introduces an immense danger zone for the broader economy. We are currently facing the severe looming threat of an AI credibility reckoning.
What happens when the reckoning hits?
Well, if executive boards cut their workforce too deeply, basing those permanent labor reductions on the inflated utopian promises made by software vendors, they will inevitably find themselves severely under capacity when the macroeconomic cycle turns.
Because the humans aren't there to catch the errors.
Exactly. When these immature tools fail to execute complex, nuanced business tasks flawlessly, there'll be no human institutional knowledge left in the building to catch the errors before they impact the client.
And what about the next generation of workers?
That's the other massive risk. We are looking at permanent labor market scarring for early career workers. If the basic entry-level tasks that have historically served as the training ground for junior employees, drafting reports, synthesizing research, running basic code checks, are entirely automated, the developmental rungs into senior knowledge work disappear entirely.
Right, you can't generate a senior partner if you eliminate the work of the junior associate.
You just can't. Finally, we face the massive, systemic risk of capital being misallocated into pure technological hype, starving other essential, historically profitable business functions of necessary investment. Ironically, the inevitable market backlash against these wildly inflated displacement claims could ultimately end up slowing down legitimate, highly effective automation in the specific, narrow areas where it actually works.
This layered threat requires immediate, highly practical defense mechanisms from the market itself. Investors and corporate boards must start demanding strict, function-level proof before rewarding executive teams with a higher stock multiple based on mere press releases.
We need better metrics.
We do. We need to establish a rigorous, standardized 12 to 18-month review window for any claimed AI efficiency program.
How would that work?
If executive management claims they are permanently cutting 10% of their workforce specifically because generative algorithms have made their operations faster and more efficient, they must be forced to prove that the tangible output per remaining employee actually rose within 4 subsequent quarters.
And what about the clients?
They must empirically prove that customer satisfaction metrics remain stable or improved. If those promised margin gains and productivity metrics do not materialize within that review window, the board of directors must treat the initiative exactly as what it is:
A failure.
a failed, highly disruptive operational restructuring, not a patient, visionary technology build. The evidentiary accountability must match the scale of the public rhetoric.
I couldn't agree more.
We have navigated an incredibly complex, contradictory corporate landscape today. We are witnessing a fundamental, layered transition where highly real, localized AI substitution in strictly codified, text-heavy domains is providing a convenient, valuation-friendly cover for broad, opportunistic corporate restructuring.
It's the ultimate cover story.
It is. The underlying technology is genuinely changing the mechanics of specific workflows, but it is simultaneously functioning as an alibi, making ordinary, brutal cost-cutting look inevitable, visionary, and entirely morally neutral to the market.
It's a fascinating and frankly alarming dynamic.
The decisive question moving forward is no longer whether artificial intelligence is changing the nature of work. It plainly is. The question is whether these massive companies can prove that artificial intelligence is replacing human labor faster than it is replacing corporate accountability. This is the research desk officially signing off.